Imagine scrolling through NASA's photo archives and stumbling upon an image that stops you cold. A dark, irregular object floating against the black void of space, its angular surfaces catching the light in ways that make it look almost deliberately crafted, almost artificial. Picture astronauts aboard Space Shuttle Endeavour in December 1998. Cameras clicking rapidly as this mysterious form tumbles past their windows in low Earth orbit, its shape shifting with each rotation like something refusing to be clearly identified. This is the infamous Black Knight satellite, an object that conspiracy theorists claim has been silently orbiting our planet for 13,000 years, predating human civilization by millennia, watching us evolve from hunter-gatherers to spacefaring beings while beaming cryptic signals back to its unknown creators. The story weaves together Nikola Tesla's mysterious 1899 radio transmissions that he believed came from Mars, unexplained radar detections during the paranoid early Cold War years when neither superpower would admit to tracking unidentified objects overhead, decoded messages that supposedly pinpoint the probe's origin to a star system 203 light-years away, and that singular 1998 photograph showing what appears to be a spacecraft of decidedly non-human design floating where no disclosed satellite should be. Some claim NASA has been quietly monitoring this ancient artifact for decades, that astronauts have been warned not to discuss it publicly, that ground control picked up Gordon Cooper's startled transmissions when he spotted it during his Mercury mission but scrubbed them from official records. Yet skeptics look at the same evidence and see a comedy of errors: misidentified space debris, natural radio phenomena that Tesla couldn't possibly have understood in 1899, Cold War spy satellite components that neither side wanted to acknowledge, and most damningly, a thermal blanket that slipped from an astronaut's gloved hands during a routine spacewalk. For over a century, this tangled web of unrelated incidents has been retroactively woven into a single narrative about alien surveillance, each generation adding new layers to a mystery that may never have existed in the first place. What is this dark object captured in those NASA photographs? Humanity's first photographic evidence of extraterrestrial technology, or simply a lost piece of insulation floating away into the void? How did completely separate events spanning 100 years become unified into one grand conspiracy theory, and who did the unifying? And why does a thermal blanket dropped during a spacewalk continue to fuel speculation about ancient alien observers despite exhaustive documentation of exactly what happened? Today, we're untangling one of the internet's most persistent space mysteries, a story that reveals as much about human pattern-seeking behavior and our desperate desire to believe we're not alone as it does about the actual objects humans have put into orbit. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because this investigation into orbit is about to expose how a collection of mundane explanations got transformed into evidence of extraterrestrial surveillance that's supposedly been ongoing since the last ice age. In the summer of 1899, Nikola Tesla sat in his experimental station in Colorado Springs, a crude wooden structure housing some of the most advanced electrical equipment on Earth. Listening to signals crackling through his primitive radio receiver, signals that would eventually become the foundation stone of the Black Knight legend, even though Tesla himself never mentioned satellites or objects in orbit. Tesla had established this remote laboratory specifically to conduct experiments with high-voltage electricity and wireless transmission. His towering 80-foot mast, topped with a copper sphere dominating the Colorado landscape like something from a mad scientist's fever dream. The Serbian-American inventor was already famous for his work on alternating current and his bitter rivalry with Thomas Edison, but by this point in his career he'd become increasingly eccentric, making grandiose claims about death rays and earthquake machines that his contemporaries found difficult to verify. During his Colorado experiments, Tesla intercepted radio signals that exhibited a regularity he couldn't immediately explain, not the chaotic crackling of lightning storms that he'd been studying, but something that seemed to have pattern and intentionality behind it. On July 4, 1899, he wrote to his friend George Scherf, stating, "We are getting messages from the clouds 100 miles away, possibly many times that distance. Do not leak it to reporters." A letter that reveals Tesla recognized something unusual but hadn't yet made the leap to extraterrestrial origins. By Christmas of 1900, when the American Red Cross asked him to predict humanity's greatest achievement of the coming century, Tesla had become convinced he'd detected something genuinely otherworldly, writing that he'd observed electrical actions which have appeared inexplicable. Faint and uncertain though they were, they have given me a deep conviction and foreknowledge that ere long, all human beings on this globe as one will turn their eyes to the firmament above, with feelings of love and reverence, thrilled by the glad news. Brethren, we have a message from another world unknown and remote. It reads 1, 2, 3. The speculation exploded immediately. Newspapers and fellow scientists began theorizing that Tesla had made contact with Martians, that Venus was trying to communicate with Earth, that an alien invasion was imminent, the kind of sensationalism that would characterize UFO discussions for the next century. Tesla himself tried to walk back the most extreme interpretations, writing to the New York Sun in 1901 to clarify that, "I did not state that I had obtained a message from Mars, I only expressed my conviction that the disturbances I had obtained were of planetary origin." He was certain only that the signals came from somewhere off Earth, not from any specific location or intelligence. What Tesla almost certainly detected was one of two natural phenomena that he had no framework to understand in 1899, either long-delayed echoes, which are radio signals that bounce off objects in space and return to the sender after the 2.7 seconds it takes for Earth-Moon-Earth communication, or signals from pulsars, those rapidly rotating neutron stars that emit regular electromagnetic pulses from their magnetic poles. Pulsars wouldn't be discovered until 1968 by Jocelyn Bell Burnell, and the regularity of their signals initially led astronomers to jokingly nickname them "little green men signals" because they seemed too precise to be natural, exactly the kind of misinterpretation that Tesla made 7 decades earlier. The long-delayed echo explanation seems particularly likely given that Norwegian researcher Jürgen Haas would document the same phenomenon in 1928, bouncing radio signals off the moon and receiving them back roughly 3 seconds later, finally explaining the mysterious timing that had puzzled experimenters. Picture Tesla in his isolated laboratory, headphones clamped over his ears as he listens to rhythmic pulses that his brilliant but limited understanding of physics cannot explain, his mind immediately leaping to the most exciting possibility rather than considering mundane natural explanations he couldn't possibly know about. The tragedy is that Tesla never followed up on these observations despite their apparent significance. He claimed other projects took priority, an astonishingly casual dismissal of what would have been the most important discovery in human history if his extraterrestrial hypothesis were correct. No recordings exist of what Tesla heard, no detailed transcriptions of the signal patterns, no attempts to replicate the observations under controlled conditions, just his word that he detected something anomalous and his speculation about its origin. Yet, this fragmentary account from 1899 would become the first piece of the Black Knight puzzle, with later conspiracy theorists claiming that Tesla had detected transmissions from an ancient satellite in polar orbit, despite Tesla never mentioning satellites, orbits, or any specific location for the signal source. How does a vague account of unexplained radio signals transform into specific claims about artificial satellites when the original investigator never made such claims and the technology to detect orbiting objects wouldn't exist for another 50 years? Fast forward to 1954, 5 full years before humanity would successfully place its first artificial satellite into orbit, when several American newspapers, including the San Francisco Examiner and the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, published startling reports claiming that the United States Air Force was tracking multiple unknown satellites orbiting Earth. Objects that appeared to be artificial yet belonged to neither superpower, some traveling in retrograde orbits opposite to Earth's rotation in a manner that human spacecraft wouldn't achieve until 1960. The timing of these reports placed them squarely in the paranoid heart of the Cold War, that anxious period when Americans practiced duck-and-cover drills in schools and built backyard fallout shelters while Soviet and American scientists raced to develop intercontinental ballistic missiles capable of delivering nuclear annihilation across the polar route. The newspaper articles generated immediate public anxiety. If mysterious satellites were orbiting overhead and neither America nor the Soviet Union had put them there, who did, and more importantly, what were they watching? The source of these sensational claims was Donald Keyhoe, a former Marine Corps aviator who had transitioned into a career as a UFO researcher and author. His 1953 book, Flying Saucers from Outer Space, having established him as a prominent voice in the emerging field of ufology. Keyhoe's 1954 pronouncements about unidentified satellites orbiting Earth appeared in the newspapers as promotional material for his latest book, essentially press releases designed to generate interest and sales, rather than peer-reviewed scientific observations with verifiable data behind them. No radar tracking data was ever released, no photographs were produced, no independent verification from astronomers or satellite tracking stations confirmed these objects' existence. Keyhoe simply announced their presence, and the newspapers dutifully reported his claims without apparent fact-checking. The respected astronomer Clyde Tombaugh, famous for discovering Pluto in 1930, is sometimes mentioned in connection with these 1954 sightings, lending them an air of scientific credibility that evaporates upon closer examination. Tombaugh never publicly endorsed Keyhoe's satellite claims, and his name appears to have been invoked without his explicit participation in the observations. These 1954 reports would later be retroactively incorporated into the Black Knight narrative, despite describing retrograde equatorial orbits rather than the polar orbit that later versions of the legend would claim. For the mysterious satellite, internal consistency has never been a strong suit of conspiracy theories that accrete details over time. The entire episode demonstrates how UFO culture was evolving in the 1950s, transforming from reports of flying saucers in Earth's atmosphere to speculation about artificial satellites monitoring humanity from space, the mythology adapting to incorporate new technological capabilities as they emerged. By 1957, when the Soviet Union shocked the world by launching Sputnik 1 into orbit, the reality of artificial satellites had arrived, but the phantom satellites of 1954 remain unexplained simply because they almost certainly never existed outside Keyhoe's promotional materials and the newspapers that uncritically repeated his claims. 6 years later, in 1960, actual mysterious satellites would be detected, but these would have a far more prosaic and thoroughly documented explanation that nevertheless gets folded into the Black Knight mythology because the truth is apparently less satisfying than the mystery. Picture Cold War America, still reeling from the shock of Sputnik's beeping passage overhead proving Soviet technological prowess, suddenly confronted with reports that unknown satellites had been up there all along, the public's imagination primed to believe that anything was possible in this new space age where yesterday's science fiction had become today's geopolitical reality. In February 1960, American newspapers reported that U.S. Navy radar had detected a dark, tumbling object in polar orbit around Earth, an orbit that would allow observation of every point on the planet as it rotated beneath. Yet neither the United States nor the Soviet Union admitted to owning this particular satellite, despite both nations having successfully placed objects in orbit by this time. Time magazine covered the story, reporting on this mysterious object that seemed to defy explanation, its existence confirmed by military tracking systems that were becoming increasingly sophisticated as the space race accelerated, and both superpowers needed to know exactly what the other was putting into orbit. The polar orbit detail seemed particularly significant because while both nations had achieved equatorial orbits by 1960, polar orbits represented a more advanced capability that would be ideal for reconnaissance satellites capable of photographing the entire surface of enemy territory, exactly the kind of strategic asset that might be kept secret during the height of Cold War tensions. What the public didn't know at the time, and what wouldn't be declassified for decades, was that the Discoverer satellite program, ostensibly a scientific research initiative, was actually cover for Corona, America's first photographic reconnaissance satellite program designed to photograph military installations inside the Soviet Union. Discoverer 8, launched on November 20, 1959, had experienced problems during its mission. It achieved orbit successfully, but the orbit was more eccentric than planned, with a perigee of just 200 kilometers but an apogee reaching 900 kilometers, meaning it swooped much closer to Earth and swung much farther away than intended. The satellite's primary purpose was to eject a film return capsule, called a bucket in program terminology, that would re-enter the atmosphere and be snagged mid-air by specially equipped Air Force cargo planes, but Discoverer 8's bucket was lost, its eccentric orbit making recovery impossible even if it could be located. What the Navy radar had detected in February 1960 was almost certainly a large piece of debris from Discoverer 8, released when the satellite jettisoned its film capsule, the unexpected size of the debris making it trackable even though the capsule itself had been lost. Time magazine actually reported this explanation once the Air Force acknowledged what the object likely was, but like so many corrections and mundane explanations, this follow-up received far less attention than the initial mystery, leaving many people with the impression that the dark satellite remained unexplained. The satellite itself and its associated debris burned up during atmospheric re-entry around March 1960. Any pieces that survived to ground level falling into the ocean or remote areas where they would never be recovered. 3 years later, the Black Knight legend acquired what seemed like high-profile endorsement when Project Mercury astronaut Gordon Cooper, the youngest of the original 7 astronauts and a man who would later become known for his openness about UFO sightings, allegedly reported seeing strange green lights during his Mercury Atlas 9 mission in May 1963. Cooper flew the longest and final Mercury mission, spending 34 hours in orbit and becoming the first American to sleep in space, his flight representing the culmination of NASA's first human spaceflight program before transitioning to the 2-man Gemini missions. Stories began circulating that during his 15th orbit, Cooper reported seeing green lights that ground control also detected on radar, with some versions claiming these lights were connected to the mysterious Black Knight satellite that was supposedly still up there, still watching, still unexplained. Cooper did indeed become a vocal proponent of UFO research after retiring from NASA in 1970, claiming to have seen unusual objects during his career as a test pilot, particularly a sighting over West Germany in 1951, when he observed several disc-shaped craft performing maneuvers that seemed beyond conventional aircraft capabilities. However, when specifically asked about the 1963 Mercury mission, Green Light's claim, Cooper himself debunked it. He produced complete transcripts from his Mercury Atlas 9 mission showing that during his 15th orbit, and indeed throughout his entire 22-orbit flight, he never reported seeing anything unidentified or unusual. Cooper's genuine UFO beliefs and his willingness to discuss them publicly made him an ideal figure to attach to the Black Knight story, but the attachment was made by others, not by Cooper himself, who was quite clear that his space flights had been UFO-free, even if his atmospheric flying career had not been. Picture the confusion that results when someone has admitted seeing unexplained phenomena at some points in their career. Suddenly, every moment of their professional life becomes suspect, with researchers unable or unwilling to distinguish between what the person actually claimed and what others have claimed on their behalf. The distinction matters enormously, but in the mythology-building process of conspiracy theories, such distinctions tend to dissolve as stories get repeated, simplified, and merged into a unified narrative that obscures the specific facts of each individual incident. If you've made it this far, you're not just curious, you're a seeker. So here's what to do next. Hit subscribe right now to join the Untold archives, because these stories are just beginning. Drop your theory in the comments. If the Black Knight is just a thermal blanket and misidentified debris, why do we want so desperately to believe in alien observers watching humanity for 13,000 years? I'll feature the best answers in a future video and share this video with someone who still thinks every mysterious space photo is proof of extraterrestrial visitation.